It was supposed to be a quiet drive, a stretch of empty road cutting through nothing but fields and forest. I had taken this route before, a shortcut between two small towns, saving time instead of sticking to the highway. I had been driving for hours, my shoulders stiff, my hands gripping the wheel just a little too tight. The sun had dipped below the horizon a while ago, leaving only a deep blue sky that would soon turn black. The road was empty, not a single set of headlights in either direction. Just me, the hum of my engine, and the occasional rustling of trees when the wind picked up. The road itself was worn down, cracked in places, barely maintained. No streetlights, no signs, just mile after mile of fading asphalt cutting through the wilderness. I had always felt a little uneasy on these roads at night. Not scared exactly, just aware of how isolated I was, aware of how long it had been since I'd passed another car, aware that if something happened, no one would be around to help. It was around then that I saw it, something on the side of the road. At first, I thought it was an animal, a deer maybe hit by a passing truck. But as I got closer, I knew that wasn't right. It wasn't sprawled out like an animal would be. It wasn't shaped like one either. It was too still, too human. I slowed down, my headlights washing over it. Person, lying in the dirt, half on the road, half in the dry grass beside it. I stopped the car. For a long time, I didn't move. My fingers curled around the steering wheel, my breathing suddenly too loud in the silence of the car. I wasn't sure what I was looking at. Could have been someone who needed help, someone who had been hurt, a drunk who had wandered too far from a bar, someone who had fallen from a truck. But something about the way they were lying there told me that wasn't it. They weren't moving, not at all. No shifting, no twitching, no slow rise and fall of breath. I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. I reached for my phone. No signal. Not surprising. Out here, it was all dead zones and static. I glanced around. Nothing but the trees and the dark. No lights, no houses, no sign of anyone else. Just me and the body on the road. I could leave. I could pretend I hadn't seen it, keep driving, and tell myself that someone else would find it. But I knew that wasn't right. I took a deep breath, turned off the engine, and opened the door. The night air was cold against my skin. I stepped closer. The body was face down, arms stretched out, one leg bent at an odd angle. A man, I thought, medium build, dressed in jeans and a jacket, dark hair matted with something I didn't want to think about. I crouched down, hesitating. Then I reached out and touched his shoulder. Cold, too cold. I pulled my hand back. He wasn't breathing. I knew it before I checked, but I did anyway, pressing 2 fingers to his neck. No pulse. His skin felt like stone. I let out a slow breath, my stomach tightening. Dead. And not recently. The stiffness, the way the skin felt, he had been out here for hours, maybe longer. I stood up, my hands shaking. I looked around again. Still nothing. No cars, no houses, no signs of struggle. Just the body and me. Something had happened here. Something bad. And I was standing in the middle of it. I backed away, my heart pounding. I had to get help. I had to find a way to call someone. I turned to head back to my car. That's when I saw it. Tracks. Faint, barely visible in the dirt beside the road. Footprints. More than one set. Someone had been here. Maybe more than one person. And not long ago. I swallowed hard, my hands clenching into fists. Whoever had done this, whoever had left this man here, they might still be around. Watching, waiting. I felt exposed, standing there in the open, my back to the trees. I turned, scanning the darkness, my ears straining for any sound. Nothing, just the wind moving through the branches, the distant hoot of an owl. But that didn't mean I was alone. I moved fast, nearly running back to my car. I yanked the door open, threw myself inside, and locked it. I took a deep breath, gripping the wheel. I couldn't just drive off. I had to do something. I tried my phone again. Still nothing. I had to get to town. Find a police station, a gas station, somewhere with a phone. I started the engine. The headlights flicked on, illuminating the road ahead. And that's when I saw something else. A shape far down the road, standing in the middle of it, not moving, watching. My stomach turned to ice. I couldn't see details, just a dark outline against the pale stretch of asphalt. But I knew without a doubt that they were looking at me, and they weren't moving. My foot hit the gas. The car lurched forward, the engine roaring in the quiet. I kept my eyes on the road, on the figure ahead. But as I got closer, they were gone. No sound, no movement, just empty road where they had been standing. I didn't slow down. I kept driving, pushing the car faster than I should have. My hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles ached. I didn't stop until I saw lights in the distance, the first sign of town. I pulled into a gas station, slammed the car into park, and stumbled out. The clerk inside looked at me like I was crazy. Maybe I was. But I grabbed the landline phone from the counter, my hands shaking as I dialed the police. I told them everything. The body, the road, the footprints, the figure in the dark. They asked me to wait, said they'd send someone out. I sat in my car, the gas station lights buzzing overhead, my pulse still racing. Felt safer here, less alone, less like I was being watched. But I knew deep down, whoever had left that body there, whoever had been standing in the road, they were still out there, and they knew I had seen. It was late October, the kind of cold that sticks to your skin and makes your fingers feel stiff even when they're wrapped in gloves. I had been driving for hours, trying to push through the exhaustion, but the road stretched on endlessly. I was deep in the countryside, somewhere between small towns that barely showed up on the map, the kind of places where gas stations were rare and cell service was even worse. I had left home that morning, planning to make it to a friend's house before midnight. He lived in a small town in the middle of nowhere, and I hadn't seen him in years. The idea of catching up sounded good at first, but the reality of the long drive made me question why I hadn't just waited for a better time. The roads were empty, my headlights cutting through the darkness, showing only trees and cracked pavement ahead. Around 10 at night, I noticed my gas tank was lower than I'd expected. I hadn't seen a gas station in at least an hour, and I started to get that uneasy feeling in my chest. I turned on the GPS, hoping it would show something nearby, but the signal was weak and the map wouldn't load. My only option was to keep driving and hope I found something soon. The road narrowed, the trees growing closer on either side. There were no streetlights, only the occasional reflective sign that glowed in my headlights before disappearing into the darkness behind me. The further I went, the more I felt like I was the only person left in the world. Then I saw him. At first, he was just a shape in the distance, standing at the side of the road. As I got closer, the details became clearer. He was tall, wearing an old, tattered coat that hung loose over his frame. His face was hidden by the hood, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He wasn't hitchhiking, he wasn't waving for help. He was just standing there, motionless, facing the road. My stomach tightened. Something about him was off. People don't just stand in the middle of nowhere at night like that. I gripped the steering wheel and forced myself to focus on the road. Just drive past him. Don't look at him. As I passed, I caught a glimpse of his face in my side mirror. His hood had fallen back slightly, revealing pale skin and eyes that seemed too wide, too focused. He wasn't looking at the road. He was looking at me. I pressed the gas pedal, my heart thudding against my ribs. For the next few minutes, I kept checking the mirror, half expecting to see him walking after my car. But the road was empty again. Still, the unease stayed with me, making my fingers tighten around the steering wheel. About 15 minutes later, I spotted a gas station up ahead. A small one with a single pump and a tiny convenience store attached. The lights were on, but the place looked deserted. I pulled in, my tires crunching over loose gravel. I stepped out, the cold air hitting me like a slap. The wind had picked up, whistling through the trees that surrounded the station. The place looked old, paint peeling from the walls, a single flickering light near the entrance. I walked to the pump, swiped my card, and started fueling up. My breath was visible in the air, the night silent except for the distant rustling of leaves. Then I felt it, that prickling sensation on the back of my neck, the feeling you get when someone's watching you. I turned my head slowly. He was there, the man from the road. He was standing at the edge of the gas station's lot, just beyond the reach of the lights. Not moving, not speaking, just watching. My hands clenched into fists. Every instinct in my body told me not to turn my back on him. I grabbed the gas nozzle, willing the pump to hurry up. My car wasn't locked. I should have locked it. The pump clicked. I shoved the nozzle back in place and forced myself to walk, slow, steady, toward my car. My heartbeat was so loud I could hear it in my ears. As soon as I got inside, I locked the doors and started the engine. My headlights flashed across the lot as I turned to leave. He was gone. I didn't wait to see where he had gone. I sped out of the station, the tires kicking up gravel, my hands shaking against the wheel. I drove faster than before, my eyes darting between the road and the rearview mirror. The gas station disappeared behind me, swallowed by the dark. The road stretched on, and I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe he was just some drifter, some guy passing through like I was. But then I saw it. A mile ahead, on the side of the road, a figure standing still. It was him. I felt my stomach drop. There was no way, no possible way he could have gotten ahead of me. I sped past him, not daring to look, my whole body tense. I didn't understand. It wasn't possible, but I wasn't stopping to figure it out. For the next 30 minutes, I kept driving. My hands ached from gripping the wheel so hard. I forced myself to breathe, to think clearly. I just needed to get to town, find my friend's place, and lock the doors behind me. Then I saw it again, another mile ahead, the same figure, the same stance, waiting. I don't remember the last few miles. My mind was blank, my body moving on autopilot, my only thought to get away. I didn't slow down for anything. Finally, I saw the lights of a town ahead. Street lights, houses, a gas station with actual people inside. I didn't stop driving until I pulled into my friend's driveway. I cut the engine, jumped out, and ran to the door, pounding until he opened it. I didn't tell him everything. I just said I thought someone had been following me. He looked at me, saw the way my hands were shaking, and didn't ask questions. He let me in, locked the door, and we left it at that. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the man on the road, standing there, waiting. The next morning, I checked the news. Nothing. No reports of anything unusual. No missing person matching his description. I tried to put it behind me, to tell myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But even now, years later, I still think about him, standing on the side of the road, watching, waiting, and I still don't know how he got ahead of me. I had been driving for hours, maybe even longer than that. My hands were stiff on the steering wheel, my back ached from the seat, and my eyes felt heavy. The road ahead stretched on endlessly, a thin strip of pavement cutting through nothing but trees and open fields. It was the kind of road that seemed like it had no real destination, just a path leading deeper into nowhere. The sun had long since gone down, and the only light came from my headlights, illuminating the cracks in the worn asphalt. I wasn't even supposed to be out here. My original route had been a straight shot down the highway, but a construction detour had pushed me further and further away from any familiar roads. I told myself I'd find my way back soon enough, but that had been 2 hours ago. I hadn't seen a single sign for a town, gas station, or even a driveway in a long time. I kept telling myself to turn around, but where would I even go? I hadn't seen another car in ages, and my fuel gauge was starting to drop lower than I was comfortable with. Then it happened. The engine stuttered, just for a second, a brief hiccup, like a missed breath, before it smoothed out again. It was enough to send a jolt of unease through my body. I glanced at the dashboard, temperature normal, oil pressure fine, gas low but not empty. I eased off the accelerator, listening for anything unusual, but the engine sounded okay. I kept driving. Another sputter, then another, a jerk forward. Panic set in. I was in the middle of nowhere, alone, with no phone signal and barely any gas left. I pressed the accelerator, trying to coax more life out of the car, but the engine choked. It bucked once, twice, then it died completely. The silence was immediate. No hum of the motor, no rumble of tires. Just the ticking of cooling metal and the distant sound of crickets. I coasted to the side of the road and sat there, gripping the wheel, staring out into the blackness. The headlights still worked, casting long beams onto the empty road, but that was it. I turned the key. Nothing. Tried again. Just the weak clicking of a dead engine. I sat there for a long time trying to figure out what to do. My phone was useless, no signal, no GPS, nothing. I had no idea where I was, how far I was from the last town, or if anyone would even drive down this road before morning. I had no choice. I had to start walking. I grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out of the car. The air was thick and damp, carrying the scent of wet grass and old asphalt. I hesitated, looking up and down the road. There was no way of knowing which direction was better, but I had a feeling I hadn't seen any signs of life for a longer stretch behind me. So I walked forward. The night was unnervingly quiet. No wind, no rustling leaves, just the crunch of gravel under my boots. My flashlight cast a narrow beam ahead, barely cutting through the darkness. The farther I walked, the smaller my car became behind me until its red taillights disappeared completely. I kept walking. Minutes passed, then an hour, maybe more. It was impossible to tell time when everything looked the same. The road stretched on endlessly, curving slightly but never revealing anything beyond trees and more road. My legs ached, my feet sore from the uneven ground. Then I saw it, a house. It was set back from the road, barely visible through the trees. An old wooden structure, dark and weathered. No lights on, no signs of movement. It looked abandoned, but I had no other options. I left the road, stepping carefully through the overgrown grass. The house loomed larger as I approached, its windows black and empty. The porch sagged under my weight as I climbed the steps. I knocked on the door, the sound dull and lifeless. No answer. I knocked again. Nothing. I tried the doorknob, turned. I hesitated, my breath catching in my throat. But standing outside was worse. I stepped inside. The air was stale, thick with the scent of dust and wood. My flashlight revealed an empty living room. Old furniture covered in sheets, a fireplace filled with ash, a staircase leading up into darkness. I moved carefully, every step creaking on the wooden floor. The house felt frozen in time, like whoever had lived here had just walked away and never returned. There were still dishes in the sink, old newspapers stacked on a table. I checked the kitchen. Empty. The hallway. Empty. I made my way upstairs, my heart pounding. The doors were all open, revealing empty rooms except one. The last door was closed. Something about it felt wrong. I reached for the handle, then I heard it. A noise downstairs. A shuffle. I froze. Another noise. Closer. I turned off my flashlight, plunging myself into darkness. I waited. The sound moved again. Slow, deliberate steps. Not an animal. Someone was in the house. I didn't breathe, didn't move. The footsteps crept through the lower level, pausing, listening. Then they started up the stairs. I backed away from the door, feeling for a hiding spot. The closet. I slid inside, pressing myself into the corner. The door was cracked open just enough for me to see out. The footsteps reached the hallway. Then they stopped, right outside the door. Silence. A long, horrible silence. Then the door handle moved, turned. Slowly, the door creaked open an inch. Then another. I didn't move. Then suddenly, the door slammed open. A figure rushed inside. I bolted. I burst out of the closet, shoving past them, sprinting for the stairs. The floorboards groaned under my weight. I heard them behind me running, fast, too fast. I hit the stairs, bounding down two at a time. I tripped near the bottom, hitting the floor hard. Pain shot through my knee, but I didn't stop. I scrambled to my feet and ran for the front door. It was still open. I didn't look back. I tore across the yard, my legs burning, lungs screaming for air. The road was up ahead. My flashlight was gone, lost in the house. I ran and ran. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I kept running until my body gave out, until the sun started to rise, until hours later, I finally stumbled onto another road, one with signs, with cars, with life. I never went back, never tried to find out who or what had been in that house. I didn't want to know. I just wanted to forget, but I never did. I never liked driving at night, especially on empty roads in the middle of nowhere. There was something about the darkness pressing in on all sides, the way the headlights barely cut through the rain, that made me uneasy. Maybe it was the silence. Maybe it was the feeling of being alone, too alone, with nothing but trees and asphalt stretching endlessly ahead. That night, I was on my way back from a work trip in the countryside. I had taken the back roads to save time, avoiding the longer highways, but now I was regretting it. The rain had started about an hour ago, and it hadn't let up since. It was the kind of rain that made it hard to see more than a few feet ahead, the kind that blurred the road until it looked like an endless, wet ribbon disappearing into nothing. The wipers struggled to keep up, smearing water across the windshield. The road was empty. No streetlights, no signs, just the occasional turn and the dark shapes of trees lining both sides of the road. My gas gauge hovered just above empty, and I hadn't seen a gas station in over an hour. I told myself there had to be one coming up soon, but deep down I wasn't sure. Then, my headlights caught something ahead, a shape moving near the side of the road. At first, I thought it was an animal, a deer maybe, but as I got closer, I saw it was a man. He was walking on the shoulder, soaked from head to toe, his clothes clinging to his body from the rain. He wasn't hitchhiking, he wasn't even looking at me, just walking head down, arms limp at his sides. Something about it felt off. Normally, people who needed help waved, tried to flag down cars, did something, but he didn't even glance up as I passed. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. My gut told me to keep driving, so I did. I checked my rearview mirror. The man was still walking, not turning, not reacting, just moving forward into the dark. The further I got, the heavier the feeling in my chest became, like I had seen something I wasn't supposed to. A few minutes later, my headlights caught something else ahead. Another figure. I slowed down. It wasn't the same man. This one was dressed differently, but he was walking in the same strange way, head down, arms hanging loose. He was just as soaked, just as lifeless looking as the first. A cold, creeping fear spread through me. What were the chances of seeing two people like that, this far apart in the middle of nowhere during a storm? I sped up. The rain pounded harder against the car, and my hands tightened around the steering wheel. My gas light came on, an angry orange glow on my dashboard. I swore under my breath. A mile later, my headlights hit a sign. Gas, 2 miles. Relief flooded through me. I could make it 2 miles. The gas station appeared a few minutes later, a small, run-down place with a single pump under a flickering yellow light. There were no other cars, just an old station building with a dark window. I pulled up to the pump, turned off the engine, and listened to the rain hammer against the roof. I stepped out, pulling my jacket over my head, and swiped my card. The pump beeped, then started filling the tank. I glanced around. The gas station was completely silent. No sign of an attendant. No sign of anyone at all. Then I saw them. The first man, the second man, both standing at the edge of the gas station lot, just beyond the reach of the lights. My stomach dropped. They weren't moving, just standing there, staring at me. I gritted my teeth and forced myself to keep my breathing steady. Maybe they were just drifters. Maybe they were harmless. But my gut told me to get the hell out of there. The pump clicked off. I shoved the nozzle back, got in my car, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. I pulled out onto the road, my tires splashing through puddles. I kept my eyes on the mirror. The two men were still standing there, watching. As I drove away, I realized something that made my blood turn ice cold. Their clothes weren't just wet. They were torn, ripped open, and they were covered in something dark. Something too dark to be just rainwater. I didn't stop again that night. I didn't even slow down. I just kept driving, my heart pounding, until I saw the lights of a town in the distance. I never took that road again. It was the kind of place most people never saw, let alone drove through. A 2-lane road cut through endless stretches of open land, the kind that made you feel small. No houses, no gas stations, nothing but flat fields on one side and thick, dark trees on the other. The only sign of civilization was the road itself, cracked and worn from years of neglect. It had been a long drive, hours of nothing but the sound of my tires against the pavement and the occasional flicker of headlights from the rare car passing in the opposite direction. I had taken this route before. It wasn't the fastest way home, but it was the only one that didn't involve looping miles out of the way to hit a major highway. It was late, well past midnight, and the only thing keeping me going was the thought of finally getting home, getting some sleep, and forgetting about the long week I'd had. Then, somewhere in the middle of that desolate stretch, my fuel gauge blinked to life. I hadn't been paying attention. I was sure I had enough gas when I left the last town, but hours of driving had drained it faster than I expected. I checked my phone, but there was no signal. Not surprising out here. I had seen a gas station maybe 50 miles back, but turning around would mean driving on empty and hoping I made it. I knew there was another station somewhere ahead. I just had to hope it wasn't too far. A few miles later, the engine sputtered. The car jerked, the dashboard lights flickered, and then the engine died completely. I coasted to the side of the road, the tires crunching on loose gravel before the car rolled to a stop. I turned the key. Nothing. Just the empty sound of a drained battery and an empty tank. I sat there for a moment, gripping the wheel, breathing through the frustration. There was no use panicking. My only option was to walk. I grabbed my flashlight from the glove box and stepped out. The air was cool, the kind of cold that settled into your skin and made you feel exposed. The road stretched ahead and behind, endless and empty. There were no headlights in the distance, no sign of another car coming. I started walking. The flashlight beam cut through the dark, bouncing with each step. The silence out here was different than in a city. No hum of distant traffic, no voices, no music spilling from open windows, just silence. I walked for what felt like an hour, my boots scuffing against the pavement. My legs ached, and the weight of exhaustion was setting in. But there was nothing else to do but keep going. Then, in the distance, I saw it. A faint glow. Lights. A building. Relief flooded through me, pushing me forward. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't a gas station. It was a small, single-story structure sitting off the road, barely visible behind a thin line of trees. It looked abandoned, the windows dark, the paint peeling. But there was a single light on the porch, buzzing faintly. I hesitated. Something about the place felt wrong. Maybe it was just exhaustion, but the sight of that lone building in the middle of nowhere made my stomach twist. But I needed help. There was no way I could keep walking all night. I stepped onto the porch, the wood creaking beneath my weight. I knocked. The sound echoed. No answer. I knocked again. Still nothing. The door was slightly open. That feeling in my stomach grew worse, but I pushed it down. If there was someone inside, I needed to ask for help. If not, maybe there was a phone. I nudged the door open and stepped in. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of dust and something else. Something I couldn't place. The flashlight cut across the room, revealing a small living area. A couch, a wooden table, a few chairs. It looked like someone had lived here once, but not in a long time. Then I saw the backpack. It was sitting on the floor near the couch, the fabric worn but clearly not old enough to belong to whoever used to live here. I wasn't alone. I turned, scanning the room, my heart pounding. The door to the next room was slightly ajar. I listened. Nothing. I should have left. I should have turned around and walked back to my car, even if it meant waiting on the side of the road for hours. But I didn't. I took a step forward, then another. I pushed the door open. The flashlight beam caught movement. A figure. Someone standing in the corner of the room, barely visible in the shadows. I froze. The person didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there. And then I saw the knife in their hand. I turned and ran. I didn't think. I didn't stop. I just ran. I heard footsteps behind me. Fast. Too fast. My boots slipped on the gravel as I hit the porch and sprinted toward the road. The flashlight bounced in my grip, throwing wild streaks of light across the trees. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs screamed for me to stop. But I didn't. I kept going until the building was a distant speck behind me. Only then did I dare to glance back. The figure stood on the road, watching. I didn't stop. I kept running. I don't know how long I ran before I finally saw headlights. A truck coming from the opposite direction. I ran straight into the road, waving my arms. The driver slammed on the brakes, barely stopping in time. The man in the truck leaned out, shouting something, but I barely heard him. I turned back toward the building, toward the figure. They were gone. I never told the driver what I saw. I just asked for a ride to the next town, to the nearest gas station. He didn't ask questions, and I didn't offer any answers. I filled up a gas can, got a ride back to my car, and drove away as fast as I could. I never looked back, but sometimes late at night I think about that building, about the person standing in the dark, waiting, and I wonder how many others had knocked on that door before me. I grew up in a quiet town, but after years of city life, I needed a break. In the summer of 2019, I rented an old farmhouse in the middle of nowhere. It sat at the end of a dirt road, miles from the nearest neighbor. The land stretched for acres, mostly fields with patches of dense forest. The air was clean, the nights were silent except for crickets, and there was no traffic or streetlights. It was exactly what I wanted. The farmhouse was sturdy but old. It had that damp, wooden smell that places get when they've been sitting for too long. The floors creaked, and the windows rattled when the wind blew hard, but it felt solid. There was a barn out back, half collapsed from years of neglect, and a well near the side of the house. I spent the first few days fixing up small things, oiling the door hinges, replacing loose planks on the porch, clearing out cobwebs in the corners. The first few nights were peaceful. I'd sit on the porch, watching the sun go down over the fields, the sky turning shades of deep orange and red. At night, I kept the windows open, letting in the cool country air. I slept better than I had in years. Then little things started to bother me. First, it was just a feeling, that sensation of being watched, like someone was standing right behind me. It would happen at odd moments, when I was working outside, when I was drinking coffee on the porch, or even when I was inside cooking. I'd look around, expecting to see a deer or some animal in the distance, but there was never anything there. Then there were the sounds. At night, I'd hear movement outside. Not the usual rustling of leaves or the distant howl of a coyote. Something heavier. Slow, deliberate footsteps in the dirt. One night, I was lying in bed when I heard the sound of gravel shifting on the driveway, like someone taking careful steps. I held my breath, listening. Nothing. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was an animal and forced myself back to sleep. But in the morning, I checked outside. The dirt road leading to the house was dry and packed, but there were fresh footprints near my car. Barefoot. They weren't mine. I always wore boots outside. The prints led from the tree line to the side of the house, then disappeared. No other tracks, no sign of someone leaving. Just a few deep imprints in the dry dirt. That was the first time I felt real fear. I started locking the doors religiously, even during the day. I kept a flashlight and a hammer next to my bed at night. I told myself it was probably a drifter passing through, but the thought of someone creeping around my house while I slept made my stomach twist. One evening, I was chopping firewood near the barn when I got that feeling again, like I wasn't alone. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the field. The tree line was about 50 yards away, dark and thick. I stopped, axe in hand, scanning the trees. Then I saw it, a figure standing between the trees. It was too far to make out details, but it was definitely a person, just standing there, not moving. I felt my pulse hammer in my ears. I raised the axe slightly, making sure whoever it was could see I was armed. They didn't move. I kept my eyes on the figure as I backed toward the house. By the time I reached the porch and turned back, they were gone. Just empty trees and fading light. That night, I barely slept. Every noise made me sit up, gripping the hammer. I kept checking the window, half expecting to see a face staring back at me. But the night passed, and morning came like nothing had happened. I considered leaving, but something in me refused. I wasn't going to let some weirdo scare me off. I told myself I'd stay one more week. The next night, things escalated. It started with knocking. Slow, deliberate knocks on the back door around midnight. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. Knock, knock, knock. I didn't move. I just sat there, gripping the hammer, staring at the door. Then it stopped. For hours, I lay awake, waiting. The silence was worse than the noise. When the sun came up, I found more footprints. This time, they circled the house. I didn't leave that day. I stayed inside, blinds shut, listening. By nightfall, I had every light on. My nerves were shot, and I was exhausted, but I refused to sleep. 2 a.m., the knocking came again. Knock, knock, knock. This time, it was at the front door. I grabbed the hammer and crept toward the door, moving as quietly as I could. I peeked out the window, expecting to see someone on the porch. Nothing. The knocking stopped. Then, from the back of the house, knock. Knock! Knock! Cold fear ran through me. There were 2 doors. Someone was trying to lure me outside. I stayed put. Minutes passed. Then an hour. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up to silence. The first pale light of dawn crept through the blinds. I felt stiff and groggy, my whole body tense from fear. I checked outside. The footprints were everywhere. Around the house, near the windows, by the barn. That was it. I packed my things, threw them in my truck, and left. I didn't care about the security deposit. I didn't stop until I reached a motel an hour away. I never went back. A few weeks later, curiosity got the best of me. I searched for news about the area, looking for anything. Break-ins, missing persons, anything that might explain what happened. I found an article from a few years earlier. A man had lived in that house before me. He'd been reported missing after neighbors noticed he hadn't been seen in weeks. When police searched the property, they found his truck, his belongings, everything untouched. No signs of a struggle, just gone. They never found him. I try not to think about what would have happened if I had opened the door that night. I've been driving trucks for a long time, longer than I care to admit. The road has a way of wearing you down, making days blend together until all you remember is the hum of the tires and the endless stretch of asphalt ahead. You stop at truck stops, get some coffee, maybe grab a meal, and then it's back to the road. Some people think it's lonely, but I don't mind it. At least most of the time. This story happened back in 2013, out in the middle of nowhere in Arizona. I was hauling a load of steel from Texas to California, and I'd taken a quieter route to avoid the worst of the traffic. It was late summer, and the heat was still sticking to everything even as the sun started setting. I remember the sky was a deep orange when I stopped at a tiny fuel station to top off my tanks. It was one of those places that barely looked open, a single pump standing under a flickering light, the little convenience store behind it half-stocked with dusty cans of food and off-brand soda. The guy behind the counter looked half asleep, didn't say a word as I paid for my fuel. I didn't hang around long, just grabbed a bottle of water and a granola bar before getting back on the road. That stretch of highway was empty, no other cars in sight, just the long, dark road ahead and the occasional glint of animal eyes from the brush. It wasn't long before I realized my air conditioning wasn't working right. The cab was getting warm, and I was already sweating, even with the windows cracked open. But there wasn't much I could do about it. I kept driving, hoping the night air would cool things down. An hour passed, then 2. The road just kept stretching on, no signs, no turns, no exits. I knew I was on the right route, but something about it felt off. Normally, even in the middle of nowhere, you'd see the occasional gas station or a rest stop, maybe another vehicle passing by. But it was just me. That's when I saw something ahead on the shoulder. At first, I thought it was an animal, a deer or a coyote. But as I got closer, I saw that it was a person. A man, standing just off the road, facing my direction. He wasn't trying to wave me down or anything, just standing there. I slowed down a little, trying to get a better look. His clothes were dark, maybe black or dark blue, and he wasn't carrying anything. He just stood there, looking at my truck as I passed. I kept driving. Something about him put me on edge. I've seen my fair share of weird things on the road. People walking in places they shouldn't be, hitchhikers standing way too close to traffic. But this guy felt different. Maybe it was how still he was, or the way he didn't even flinch as my truck thundered past him. I checked my side mirror. He was still standing there, watching. The further I drove, the worse the air in my cab got. It felt thick, heavy, like I was breathing in something stale. The warm air blowing from the vents wasn't helping, and I was starting to feel lightheaded. Another mile down the road, I saw something again. Another person, standing on the shoulder, dressed the same as the last one. I checked my clock. I'd been driving straight, no turns, no crossroads. There was no way someone could have gotten ahead of me on foot. I didn't slow down this time, just kept driving. My hands were tight on the wheel. The night stretched on. My water bottle was empty, but I didn't want to stop. Every time I passed another mile marker, my gut told me something was wrong. I should have seen a sign for a rest stop by now, or at least another car. Then, another figure, standing on the side of the road, dressed just like the others. This time, I didn't look too closely. I kept my eyes on the road, my foot pressing down just a little harder on the gas. 30 minutes later, I saw another, then another. Every few miles, there was someone standing on the shoulder. I didn't know what to do. I wasn't stopping, that was for sure. My truck was running fine, I still had fuel, but my skin was crawling. Every instinct in me was screaming that something was wrong. And then, up ahead, I saw headlights. Relief flooded through me. Another truck. I flashed my high beams as I got closer, just to acknowledge the other driver. But as I got closer, something felt off. The truck was in my lane. It was moving slowly, but not fast enough to be normal. I hit my horn. No response. I started slowing down, my tires rumbling on the pavement. My headlights lit up the back of the trailer. It was a rig just like mine, but something about it looked wrong. There were no markings, no logos, just plain metal. I edged into the other lane, preparing to pass. But as I did, I got a look at the cab. The windows were down, and the driver's seat was empty. I stared for half a second too long. The truck swerved slightly, and I had to jerk my wheel to keep from clipping it. My heart was pounding. I hit the gas. I passed it, watching in my mirror as the empty truck faded behind me. I didn't know what the hell was going on. My hands were shaking. And then, up ahead, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A sign. A green highway sign. But the words on it were wrong. Instead of listing a town name or an exit number, it just said, "No stopping," that was it. Nothing else. I kept driving. My foot was pressed down on the pedal harder than it should have been, but I didn't care. My water bottle rattled in the cup holder. My breath was coming fast. Another 10 minutes passed. Then I saw taillights ahead. Another truck. The same one. I passed it again. The exact same unmarked trailer. The exact same empty cab. I didn't know how, and I didn't care. I kept going. I don't know how long I drove. Time stopped making sense. And then, just like that, my radio crackled. Static. The first sound I'd heard all night other than my own breathing. I don't remember much after that. Just that, eventually, I saw a real sign, one that told me how many miles to the next town. I pulled into a real truck stop, filled my tanks, and sat in my cab for a long time before I could convince myself to keep going. I never took that route again. I don't know what I saw out there, but I know one thing for sure. I wasn't supposed to stop.